Welcome back from lunch. Could you all be seated as soon as possible so that we do not add to the time that we have already lost this morning? Thank you very much. I can see that some people are still coming. All right, so welcome back to this. We're now starting our parallel sessions for the afternoon. That will be followed by plenaries afterwards. And this first parallel session, at least this one, is on protecting civic space and enhancing participation and representation. The two other sessions, parallel sessions this afternoon, are on youth empowerment and digital democracy and are taking place in other rooms that are listed outside. So I hope you are in the right room this afternoon. We're a small group compared with this morning, because this is a parallel, but it is a big group nevertheless. I'm sure we'll have lots to share and exchange. So one of the key messages that actually is coming out of the trust survey is actually striking, to be honest, that less than 1/3 of people feel they don't have a say in government decision making. And among those, youth, those with less financial means, and women feel that they are the most excluded. So that's quite worrisome to some extent in a democracy. So how can government create the conditions so that people do have a voice, and what can be done so that it can actually happen? So to discuss these issues, I would now like to invite Iverna McGowan, who is a director from the Center for Democracy and Technology, to moderate the panel and ask all the panelists to come on stage, please.
Thank you very much. Checking sound? There we go. Thank you very much. Delighted to welcome you all to this afternoon session on protecting civic space and enhancing participation and representation. As many of you working in this space will of course be aware, we're in a particularly challenging moment. I think it's safe to say for civic space globally. We have seen backsliding of democratic principles, shrinking civic space for civil society and human rights defenders globally, and I would say attacks on the rule of law in different ways. And at the same time, perhaps the paradox of that is that we have also seen some levels of extraordinary civic participation and action, much of which has been happening online. If we think of the Me Too movements, the Black Lives Matter movements, Fridays for Future. So there has been a huge example of how citizens and communities can mobilize around issues that they care about. And in a more formal way, that's also been happening through citizens' assemblies, through consultative forums, and we've got that increasing feeling of maybe moving slightly away from the more traditional political party structures to ideas of direct democracy and participation. And that's why this discussion today on civic space and participation is so timely and so welcome. I myself am leading the Center for Democracy and Technology, and for those of you not aware, it's a not-for-profit working on democracy and human rights in the digital age. And so I will be using my moderator's privilege, obviously, to weave in some of these questions just about how we, on one hand, capitalize on technology in innovative ways to help participation, but we do so in a manner that's very mindful of the fact that technology is not neutral. We see discrimination perpetuated online. We know there's issues around online expression and civic space that need to be very carefully paid attention to as well. So we've been running a little bit behind today, so I'm going to be introducing the speakers momentarily. I will say the word democracy when you've got 1 minute to go each time, as I've been instructed very carefully to try and keep us as an indication. And really looking forward to these discussions today. So I'll briefly introduce our panel before opening for our first questions. Firstly, we're very grateful to have with us Mr. Mario Campalargo, Secretary of State for Digitalisation and Administrative Modernisation of Portugal. We have Martin Abergu, who is the Vice President for Programmes at the Ford Foundation, is joining us online. We have Paul Masson, who's Chief Country Support of the Open Government Partnerships, and Hendrik Naar, who's EU Public Affairs Manager at MAIG.org, and Ilsa Pilioski, Director of Public Governance at OECD. So these are a very distinguished panel, but given our short time, I'll let you look up their bios individually online. Many of them don't even need introduction. So to kick off our first panel today, obviously it's really important to think about what are the main trends and good practices that we are seeing in the fields about civic space and enhancing participation in a meaningful way. And I might first come to you, Minister Campalargo, on that of what are you seeing in Portugal and what are the practices and good trends that you'd like to share with us from your perspective?
Thank you, Iverna. Thank you. Well, Portugal feels very good in this domain, and it's so interesting that with OECD and the important initiative around civic space scan, we have had the opportunity to do it in Portugal. Actually, I'm proud that we were the second country to be scanned. And why is this important? Because no matter the views that we may have in one country, they may be always culturally biased towards this country. So it's very important to have a different and unique lens seen from the outside that will look into the public service reforms from a perspective that is very much biased in the good sense from the rights-based approach and looking at how much we put the citizen in the center of our activity. And so, having done this exercise with OECD, we feel that we have a relatively well-protected civic space, and that in some aspects we are top performers, and this obviously is very important for a country like Portugal and the democracy established and that wants to preserve the rights of everybody. We have it protected not just from the legal point of view, the institution, but also in terms of some of the policies that we put in practice every day. If we look from the point of view of the provision of services, we have a provision of the service, namely from a digital perspective that is absolutely centered in the user. We have developed in our agency for modernization a laboratory that precisely brings a multi-discipline approach to try to understand the perspective of the user rather than the perspective of the institutions to provide the services, and the so-called Lab X is really important in the sense of bringing this centrality of the users. Having Paul on my right side, obviously I will refer that Portugal has also a strong commitment to OGP and this multi-stakeholder approach, and obviously if you look to our legal construct, you will see important measures regarding, for example, national strategies for equality and non-discrimination, or even to specific aspects, for example, the integration of Roma communities. So those are just some examples of how we tackle the thing. But obviously, working more importantly in one aspect that I think that is particularly important, we need to, and this is the digital perspective, in order to bring the society together with us, we need to work with them in the digital literacy. Basic and advanced digital literacy is fundamental to encourage the digital participation. It's true that in our municipalities today, it's absolutely clear that the presidents, the mayors, go and talk with people. It's clear that at government level we have also this approach. But having this means of conveying gatherings, getting the information from the citizens, from public digital platforms, is important to have everybody involved in this the digital literacy. And giving the power for the citizens to help us defining the strategies in the legal context. We have public consultations, hopefully we'll have later time to refer some of those, but being today, right now in this moment, just a few weeks before approving an important a resolution law, legal environment to decrease the cost of context in the environment that is an area where people is very keen on contributing. We have launched a public consultation during 2 months, and we see an enormous engagement, not just of the associations, not just of the persons that are normally involved in the environment, but individuals that want to make their contribution regarding the law. And that's the dynamics that we have in Portugal. Obviously, in order to do that, we have to refine policies like data availability, like protection of the data privacy for the citizens. But all of that is part of a context in which we believe that we have the right measures, and we have always to do more, but we're in the right track.
Thank you. Perfectly on time. Thank you very much. So I heard two really important points there. A rights-based approach, and I have to say it's a pleasure to hear that at a ministerial level as well. It's something that's extremely important in this area. And also the point that you made about Roma integration, because obviously something we have to be particularly mindful of in using these digital tools is not to increase the digital divide.
Precisely.
So I think that's an extremely important point. So coming to you, Paul, obviously this has given us a really interesting insight into a national perspective. You're working at the global level, so really interested to hear the trends that you're seeing in positive measures in that respect.
Thanks. Let me share four of them. But first, let me thank the OECD. I think the work that the OECD is doing with their trust surveys and their civic space scans for a platform like OGP is really important. It gives reforms and reformers a hook at country level to tackle some of these very tricky issues. Without public participation in civic space, obviously you cannot open government, right? So for us, these are two critical elements. But I think we have to be careful in conflating them, right? If you look at what's happening in OGP, you see that public participation is the positive, is on the rise. There's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of growth around it. But it is happening against the backdrop of where civic space, also in terms of processes, institutions, rights, is under threat and under decline. And we as a partnership also have not been able to curb that trend ourselves. So positives, I promise you positives, so I'll switch. The first one is, I think after 10 years of OGP, we can say one thing very clearly and loudly, which is if you work with civil society properly, you get more ambitious, better designed reforms, and you get better early results. Our data after 10 years across 77 countries, more than 4,000 commitments, very clearly says that. And I think that's an important one for anyone who still doubts if participation is just an add-on of extra work. It's not. It actually pays off. And some countries, luckily, also using that to address civic space issues. For example, in Nigeria, I'm not sure if you remember, but 2 years ago, there were the riots against the police violence. Civil society and government used the OGP platform to come together and think through how police violence could be curbed and how oversight of police could be strengthened. The fact that there was an existing process of collaboration and dialogue meant that there was enough trust to tackle also something that difficult, like violence of the police. Secondly, I think the actual OGP process at the national level creates very often opportunities in tricky civic space situations like Nigeria, but also like day-to-day policy making. And sometimes you need the expertise and the buy-in from stakeholders, even if you technically don't need to involve them. So Latvia, for example, created a whistleblower law, which is always a tricky law to come into place in any country, and very clearly designed it in an interagency, but also with external stakeholders from the private sector and civil society to not just create the law, which is, you can almost copy-paste it, but to actually get the buy-in from society for it. So there's a positive trend of participation that pays off. The second one is we see that it's the strongest approach and value that countries use when they open up government. In the early days of OGP, many of the commitments were around transparency, opening up government-held information. That is still a big one, and it's getting stronger in how governments open up information and what people can do with it. But the big trend, clearly on our side, is that participation, either as a standalone commitment or as an integrated commitment for countries that want to work on corruption or service delivery or justice reforms, etc. Very often nowadays, there's an element of participation in there, and not just of creating the opportunity to participate, but actually also the opportunity of governments to listen. So that's a second positive trend where you see participation in thematic areas come through more than as just sort of a standard approach. Two quick ones. I see you want to say the word democracy. I could tell it. So there's a lot of innovation around it. One shout out on that, I think, is on Finland, who used the outcomes of the OECD recommendation on how to improve trust to strengthen their national dialogues. They have an approach of, on the important topics, actually going out there and talk to citizens, not just civil society, but citizens. They've done it around the lockdown, they're doing it, or they've done it around defending democracy and what that could look like, and I think that's a very important innovation. Thirdly, we see, we see commitments moving from participation in the sort of the tick-the-box type approach to actually governments understanding that if you participate, if you create opportunities for participation, you also have to listen and respond. So that's clearly a trend. Again, in Kaduna, the governor realized at some point that there was so much going wrong with government funding projects, and he had no clue how to get a grip on it. And he turned to the citizens to become the eyes and ears for him, to help him. And he committed in return, if citizens told him that a project wasn't being delivered or not delivered rightly, he promised to respond. What happened is that much more projects got delivered and at higher quality. So it was a win-win. And finally, and I'll stop there, is there's a tremendous wave and opportunity of participation at the local level. The proximity of government and citizens at the local level makes that a really important place to build trust, to create opportunities for public participation, but also to strengthen the rights. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. And just to, I think a message that comes out strongly there as well, that we talk about the importance of participation, but also how useful that formalizing somehow those structures for participation helps build relationships and trust over time. And indeed, we're working together at EU level, OGP, on the Digital Services Act implementation that we were talking about this morning on the first panel, because there again, meaningful participation across the region in Europe will be key to protecting rights and democracies in practice. Martin, over to you online. Obviously, there is this emphasis in many countries of greater representation and participation. From your perspective, why is this important for democracies, and how can governments and civil society seek to promote and protect it?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really sorry I cannot be there in person with all of you, but I hope this is working well and you can listen to me. There is very strong alignment between what has been already said and some of the notes that I'm planning to share. So I'll try to elaborate a bit further in terms of some of the key questions that have been raised. And when we are talking about democratic backsliding, or there is no doubt that there are many, many factors, but the fact that many democracies are failing to deliver is key in why people are losing trust in democratic institutions and representatives. And of course, one key factor for this lack of trust is the perception, real or just a perception, but that elected officials and administrations are not responsive to people's concerns, but to a special interest. We have been talking about the concept of a state capture in many countries, and it has a very specific meaning in widely corrupt or dysfunctional countries. But the concept of a state capture also has a very, feels very real in well-established democracies in which all sorts of lobbies plays an oversized role and influence. Along the same lines, when we think about growing economic inequality, which is actually the key focus of the organization that I work with, when we look at growing economic inequality around the world, including, again, well-established democracy, this may be actually the best indicator that these governments are not working for the vast majority of the population, but protecting the interests of the wealthiest. So if we are going to reverse these trends, we need to work at many levels. Let me start with just a few. First, we do need to do a better job in securing that people who are elected are a better representation of society as a whole and not part of economic, cultural, or political elite. This may be quite an obvious point, but it's still worth underlining that leadership needs to mirror society. We need more women, more minorities representation, different socioeconomic backgrounds. All of these need to be part of what constitutes a responsive government. Of course, this is an electoral system issue, but it's also about more complex socioeconomic issues that interfere with the election of ordinary people. A second point that I would make, and this is very much aligned with what has been said before, is that we need to ensure that we protect and strengthen other means of participation for ordinary people, civil society and social movements. The protection of civic space is important because it is a key tool to ensure a more equitable access to political power institutions. If civic space is limited, as it has been said, it means that only a few more powerful players will have access to influencing policymaking. As we seek to address wealth inequality, there is also a need to put in place redistributive economic policies. But I see that actually as a natural result of having more representative and responsive governments. In this sense, the growing wealth gap is as much a political problem as an economic challenge. My last point in this moment is that in these conversations about rebuilding trust, we spend a lot of time talking about politics and politicians, but we do not spend enough time understanding how people's expectations have changed, how the last 40 years of a very specific form of capitalism have dramatically reshaped our societies. And that's why one of the reasons why I think that a lot of the work that the OECD is actually doing in capturing those expectations is critically important. It's not only that geopolitics or information technologies have changed in the last 2 decades. People demands today are very different what they used to, and we need to do a better job of unpacking their expectations about 21st century inclusive and responsive governments if we are going to be able to confront these trends that we are describing here. Let me stop here and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And indeed, I think that point of having representatives that reflect society is a really important one. And I mean, particularly when we think alone of the representation of women in parliaments, it's kind of shocking in this day and age of where we are, and that never mind going into the more socio-economic representation and other factors as well. So, Hendrik, if I can maybe come to you on this point, because this is relating a little bit to how do we reach out to broader sections of society, and I know with the work that you're doing that you're developing mechanisms of public consultations using different digital tools. So in your view, what has been the benefit of that broader outreach of public consultations?
Yeah, thank you. And indeed, I was also going over the thoughts that I came up with ahead of the panel, and many things were already echoed before, so I'm kind of following up on what was Martin said. Indeed, the great benefit in it is really to create a link between government, administration, policymakers, and citizens, even between elections, because often we think in these 4-year, 5-year election cycles, but everything that happens between is often not as much embraced as it could be. And within this momentum of creating a better link, there is 2 points I think that are crucial when it comes to the benefits, which is the one, nurturing the process, feeding in new ideas, so enhancing more participation. And the second point is appropriation of a wider group of people in the lawmaking process and also in the ultimate outcome of legislation, which also feeds into the element of trust that, of course, we were hearing earlier today about. Talking about the first point, nurturing the process, enabling more diverse ideas to come in, more colorful ideas to come in this process, of course, has the imperative to also have a diverse set of people joining this process, and this is exactly what Martin also referred to. So if we don't have a diverse group of people joining consultations, we cannot ensure that the legitimacy is actually there, that we can say, okay, we here open up to a bigger audience that is then allowed to fit into this process. And in this light, I think it's also important to distinguish between consulting organized interests. So also the example of Portugal was very interesting to hear, because there we had organized interests as well as citizens jumping on the consultation and feeding in. So organized interests on the one hand, but also people that may have not engaged in these topics and this process on the other hand, but they still have a stake in it, obviously, and have a valid contribution to make in this regard. So first point, nurturing the process with a diverse set of actors. And the second point, appropriation, refers to to the scale of the people that we get on board, because of course it's good if it's diverse, the people that you're consulting and like engaged in this process, but if we don't manage to get it to a large scale and keep it quite low, we will not enable the big public debate about it that is actually needed in order to have a wide group of people appropriating this process, and then with this also the outcome, which then ultimately also hires the level of trust in the process as well as in the outcome, because it was not some elected people that made this law, but actually was made together between citizens in the first place, and then administrations and elected officials in the second place. And I think this feeds in very well with what was said before, giving the example of the Latvian process on the whistleblower law, because then you had this buy-in into the outcome of the process because of a larger consultation before. And building on this, the civic space is needed to enable exactly these conversations and these consultations, right? To enable the diverse process as well as the big process, that we come to a democratic and constructive and civil way to explore our ideas and to raise our ideas in a good manner. And this is exactly, as you said before, where we came from when we started our initiative on building a platform that can enable that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And indeed, there is that, I mean, obviously the great advantage is the outreach that these innovative tools can give us. And I think we also then need to be mindful of the issues that, as you mentioned as well, and had been mentioned earlier, about privacy, security, and all these other topics, given sometimes the sensitivity of political views and other things being disclosed through that. So obviously, politicians are extremely interested in what citizens are thinking in the run-up to an election, because that's a strategic thing to do, of course, because it's winning hearts and minds to do that. But then sometimes the challenge has been what happens between those electoral moments. What about the promises of campaign? How are they translated meaningful? And how do we keep citizens and others engaged throughout the process? And Elsa, I wanted to come to you on that question, because I know with the oversight the OECD has, how have you seen, what ways are citizens in the OECD countries becoming involved in governance and participation in those moments in between elections?
Well, thank you very much, Iverna. Let me take a step back. When we opened the Reinforcing Democracy agenda about 18 months ago with our 38 countries, the idea behind was what's happening in our democracies, even the most well-established, the most solid ones, that is destabilizing them. And we knew at the time, right from the beginning, that participation and representation was core to that. It was one of the first 3 pillars that we have. Since then we have 5, but it was one of the first 3 pillars. When we started looking at the results of the trust survey, and the results have been mentioned again, I mean, 30% of the people do not feel they have a voice. Just under 4 in 10 people think that a government would improve a poorly performing service, implement an idea, or change a national policy in response to public demands. We realized that this was much more of a driver than we thought. And it's been said before, I think part of it is a change in citizens' expectations. It's not that our democracies are doing worse on this issue than they used to. They are doing, if you compare numbers in terms of representation and participation, they are doing better in terms of absolute numbers, but the expectations of the citizens have changed for the better. I really think for the better. It's a question of maturity of democracies. So to go back to your question is, what can we do about it? I mean, what's happening that's responding to that? So of course, now we have the digital tools, digital platforms, we have networks that allow significant citizen participation, and we have a few concrete examples. We have the recent conference on the future of Europe that gathered 700,000 participants to share ideas on what they expect from the European Union. So that was an incredible example. We have examples from Finland on reforming its Climate Act with also very active citizen participation, including a specific focus on youth, but also on the indigenous Sami population. We have other very well-known examples. For example, from Spain is Decidim, which is very well known, which was first developed by Barcelona City Council and has been used now in more than 30 countries worldwide. And we also have, you have mentioned it in your introduction, a growing trend towards citizens' assemblies and deliberative processes. Ireland has delivered some of the most well-known examples of citizens' assemblies on abortion, aging populations, climate change. It's quite amazing. France has also had a recent example on the Convention citoyenne pour le climat, which was also a large experiment as well. We also have many participatory budgeting experiences, and Portugal has done the very first nationwide participatory budget in the world, but it's also happening at local level in cities such as Paris, Seoul, Mexico City, Tartu, Glasgow, and many more. So there are many experiences like that. Now the difficulty or the challenge is actually to be able to embed these processes into representative democracy. And that's the learning that we have to go through as democratic countries. It will take time. It's not going to happen in 1 year, 2 years. It's probably going to take at least a decade to be able to find the right balance and to find the institutional solutions. Many things will be seen as failures, are difficult to deal with, especially from the executive power. But this is clearly the trend, and we need to move and work towards that.
Thank you so much. As you can probably tell by the lilt of my accent, I am Irish, and so I can't resist commenting. It links a little bit to something that Martin had said online, because on the Citizens' Assembly around sexual reproductive health rights and the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, what I found striking was, I think that actually the population had already moved forward, but because of that mismatch of less women in Parliament, less cross-section of society, there was a disconnect with what the political class really and citizens, and that was one of the successes of that assembly that actually even unlocked it politically when it became a realization that society had moved forward in realizing those sexual reproductive health rights. So that's a very positive note to the first part of our panel today. So in round 2 questions, and Paul, I'd like to come to you here again. We've talked here that we've seen a surge of positive participation, innovative tools, trends that are positive in different OECD countries and elsewhere. And at the same time, and you've mentioned it before, we know that there are challenges, and specifically with civic space, both in Europe and globally. Just speaking from here, could you speak a little bit to that on OGP countries and what you're observing?
Thanks, yeah, and I really liked sort of how, let me say that first, how the answers of the first round sort of came together, right? Like the importance of the representative democracy, let's not throw it away, but strengthen it with all this innovation and ideas about, participation, democracy, engagement between elections. And I think there's something really powerful in there, where Elsa left us off with saying, like, how can we embed it, and with that get a very strong new form of democracy. So interestingly, if you look at OGP, so we have 77 national members, you would think, okay, those are the leading ones globally when it comes to open government, so probably also civic space. Actually, it's not. If you look at the last decade, out of the 77, only six did not decline. 3 improved, 3 stagnated, all the others declined on their civil liberties scores in all the international indices. And I think that says something about the trend of the world in a way, right? We have in the partnership also 5 members currently that do not pass our own value check, which is a measure of can civil society enter, exit, and operate in a society, in public life. I think that's a very serious warning as well. Now, why is that? I think there's it's interesting to sort of see that for countries it's much more difficult to use a voluntary platform like OGP to make commitments on civic space, not participation. Participation they do, but on civic space, than it is, for example, on anti-corruption. And I think there's a couple of reasons that are external and a couple of reasons that are internal in a way to us as a community where we can do better. External is, I think there is across the board still in general a lack of political willingness to tackle this and to really own it and think through, like, this is part, if we talk about democracy, we also have to talk about civic space, about really not just sort of experiment with participation, but also fundamentally and structurally improve the civil liberties in the spaces to participate. And I think the challenges, and we heard the Prime Minister speak about this eloquently this morning, is for populists and autocrats, you know, that's very digestible fast food almost, no? It's like easy to eat, and you want it every moment of the day. Whereas democracy is much more complex, no? It's more like fine dining. And I think we have to think through how we can make our offer, in a way, more appealing. And I think we can try to learn from populists and autocrats what they do right, not right, fully right, but you know what I mean, in how they talk about certain things. I think with civic space, one of the things which we see inside OGP is that where civil society and where political leaders are able to translate the principal right of civic space into a practical good and figure out why it is important to improve the space for civil society to participate, why you want participation around anti-corruption or around the extractive industry, why it is important to open up and create opportunities for citizens to respond around climate change and shaping climate change programs. If you manage to change your language and change your entry points into it, I think you get a lot more traction inside OGP. So you have to translate what it looks like. If you turn that to the OECD again, I think the OECD recommendation, the DAC recommendation on civil society engagement is a very powerful instrument because governments do listen to sort of OECD recommendations, right? The difference again with OGP is a voluntary platform. It's a platform of the willing. And if the willing wants something, you get something incredibly powerful. But if they don't want it, you don't get a lot. Whereas recommendation of the OECD gets you something that we can't offer. And I think the OECD having a recommendation about what civil society engagement looks like and how to respect, protect, and promote civic space is incredibly important to translate. Final point is if you translate it back to OGP again, we're developing a new strategy for the next years ahead. Democracy and democracy beyond the ballot box is at the core of it, as is public participation. But it's also the elements of how can you strengthen reformers? How can you empower them more? What do they need to push for civic space? Is it the skills? Is it the recognition? Is it the knowledge and the statistics and the examples of doing it? How can you inspire political leaders especially more to make civic space a number one issue they want to act on because they actually realize it is something that will make democracy stronger, and with that, to turn back to your point, improve their chances of re-election as well.
Thank you. Martin, I'm going to come back to you online. Obviously, as we've said, and I've experienced this over many years working in human rights and democracy, some of the ways in which civic space is being shrunk. So this comes from, smear campaigns, misuse even of anti-terror laws to shrink the space, making it difficult to register, and different freedoms. And as I'd mentioned before, even how the online space, if not carefully regulated and curated in the respect of the rule of law. So it's really interesting to hear from you as a funder of programs. I mean, you obviously see this across so many organizations. What comes out as ways that really work to protect civic space and strengthen that enabling environment in your experience? And if you could keep your intervention to close to 4 minutes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. And, I think let me answer this in a slightly different way. I think that the key question that all of us, in these conversations are struggling with is, what do we need to do differently to re-legitimize democratic governance, and how do we ensure that it actually works for those historically marginalized, right? Within my own area of work, I would say civil society must do its own reckoning about what went wrong and to what extent we may have inadvertently contributed to the delegitimization of democratic governance and polarization, particularly, again, among the most disenfranchised. And, again, I think that there are positive lessons coming out of recent experience of civil society and social movements working on very challenging issues and creating new social consensus around topics that could be very divisive. So I do think that there are good examples. You mentioned the example in your home country, Ireland. I can mention my own home country, Argentina, where, basically we had a very similar experience in terms of the feminist movement, bringing new voices into a conversation and moving the society at the right time. I think that there are other examples related to indigenous peoples that are also interesting in terms of how you can institutionalize participation in a way that really creates the space for participation and creates the space for the re-legitimation of participation in the way that we are discussing. But I do think that, these examples are not always the rule. And, there are many examples in which participation has also been tricky, right? Like, I will argue that the fight against corruption in some cases have actually had a very negative impact on democratic governance, paradoxically, right? So we need to be very mindful that we do not necessarily know, what is the path to get to where we need. But at the same time, there are interesting tools that we are testing, and we need to be open to continue doing that. But beyond civil society, I think that the international community must do a better job in generating positive incentives to strengthen democratic governance. And this is very much aligned with what has been said in this panel, and Paul was just talking about it. For many decades, we had in place an international human rights system that, with all its shortcomings, was actually very effective in protecting and promoting democratic governance, mostly around civil and political rights standards. But that system is no longer working as it used to be, and we have been making limited progress in renovating it. In this context, I will agree with Paul, the OECD and OECD member countries are critical actors in renewing the global community's commitment to democratic governance. Protecting and promoting civic space and civic engagement that ensures that everyone can be part of decision-making process in those areas that are directly affecting their lives is critically important these days. And, there are a few ways that you can do that. I think that taking a different approach to representation and participation, as has been described, is a key one. And taking also a different, a collective approach by seeking to develop OECD's standards on civic space and democracy. The fact that many OECD countries are themselves facing unprecedented challenges in terms of democratic governments related to demographic changes, migration, polarization, online hate, harassment of excluding people, make inequality. I think that all this makes it more critical than ever that these countries focus on this and actually sets a stronger example along the lines that we need. I do want to wrap it up saying that standing up for democracy today may look different than it used to, right? It may not be that right now it may not be about naming and shaming, but about peer-to-peer accountability. I think that peer-to-peer accountability is central in a moment like this. Setting clear standards, as mentioned, also very important, related to expectations or around civic space, fair election, misinformation, privacy. And this is why, institutions like OECD have a critical role to play, and all of us can certainly work together, to ensure that we reimagine what the international community needs to do if we are going to make a difference in these extremely challenging moments.
Thank you. Thank you. So a really interesting idea to moving from naming and shaming to I guess, a bit of peer pressure and peer accountability. Elsa, on that note, when OECD governments are working together, what do you think they can do to encourage each other, or in practical terms, to protect civic space and an enabling environment?
Well, thank you again for this important question. But let me go back to what was just said, because I think there were words that were very important in what was just said. First, the idea of re-legitimizing democratic governance. I think we're at that time of history. So that means indeed that the tools that we had to maintain and make sure that democracies were standing on their feet are probably not enough anymore, or they may be different. And one of the things that is important regarding civic space is that we all thought, democracy was stable, at least in our advanced countries, in the same way we felt that civic space was protected, even if, civil society was always a reminder of the limitations that existed anyway. It's still a constant fight. But today, with the closing of the civic space, what I personally think is happening is that governments today should own the civic space issues. They should be the ones also taking that agenda forward, not only civil society anymore. It's not sufficient anymore. So one of the things that we are doing at the OECD, and I see my colleague there, Alessandro, Bellantoni, who's leading that work, we will be publishing a first OECD report on the protection and promotion of civic space, which is called Strengthening Alignment, also with the international standards and guidance. So, of course, there are many, many reports on civic space being published by civil society, on which we draw quite significantly. But this is also a report that will have government data and that will be government-owned. So this is a first for us. It's a big advancement, and we're really happy with that. And we do document, like our civil society actors, crackdowns on peaceful assembly, harassment against journalists and media, restrictive laws governing civil society, limitations on media, freedom of expression, access to information, including in some OECD countries. So also, obviously, this is a report that will look at 52 countries, with 33 of which are OECD members, and they aim at supporting raising standards, including in our countries, on facilitating freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, the right to protest, counter discrimination and exclusion, fostering a public interest information ecosystem. We talked a lot about this morning. Safeguard, obviously, and protect human rights defenders, journalists, whistleblowers, and other groups, and also create an environment in which CSOs can operate, flourish, and contribute to society, protect civic space domestically and in partner countries, and engage citizens in decision-making. A lot of our countries already have strategies to support their CSO sectors, about half of our countries. We hope to move to 100%, obviously. But this is how we aim to continue, is by getting the data, getting them owned by government, and so that governments can move ahead jointly. And let me also say that we are developing also our first index on open, participative, and representative government, I think it's called for now, that will look also at all of these issues, and we will probably be able to publish the results of this index I'm looking at my colleague there, but between 6 and 1 year, within 1 year. So it's a big one. So peer pressure.
Thank you, and I think that's a really important question that you raised about ownership as well, because that's only when the real, I guess, change and ownership will happen. Hendrik, so, we talked a lot about the different modalities for consulting the public, but then how are these aspirations or ideas, how can they be translated then into policy and into laws that will actually make the changes that people want to see?
Yeah, I think here the big question is, of course, the so what, right? So once you have established your processes and your ways to engage people, the question is always what's coming afterwards. And I believe the big point here that is basically the baseline we have to take into consideration is transparency. So transparency from the very beginning, in the way that everyone knows who can be held accountable for what. So what is the duty, let's say, of the participants? Who is going to follow up on this? Who is in charge of? I can hold accountable as a citizen afterwards that something is happening with these results. And I think it corresponds very well with the listen and respond. So not only the listening part from the government side, but also the responding part, as well as timelines, right? So when can I expect that something will happen? Because we talk about consultation in our case, and here obviously we don't talk about direct democracy, right? So we don't talk about things will be implemented as they were put forward. Neither for participatory budgeting, what was said before, where you can take tangible decisions. We talk about widening the pool of ideas, about diversifying the ideas that are in the room, and opening exactly the civic space in which then we can be discussed. And if this is clearly said from the very beginning, this process, the accountability, then it is more of a natural transition that we come to the implementation phase, because everyone knows what is my job in this whole process. And if we step this right, and if we get everyone on the same page from the start, the implementation phase will come as less of a challenge rather than having it open from the very beginning. So yeah, being sufficiently transparent, having the citizens to know what is their role in it, the administrations as well as the policymakers, I think is the key part, as well as having a solid analysis, obviously, of the outcomes to make them tangible and to make them translatable into law, ultimately.
Thank you. So now, coming back to the Minister, we've all said things that governments should be doing. We've outlined how difficult it is to do all of that. It'd be really interesting to hear from you, actually, in this area, actually having the power of being a Minister, what are the challenges you see to some of these ideas that have been thrown out there, and how are you navigating them and succeeding in different ways in your view in Portugal?
I think that this is the topics where the more you do, the more you need to do. So we feel in this crossroad. I also mentioned, for example, that Portugal was the first to start a budgetary participatory program nationwide, and it is the case. The challenge that comes next is how do you implement the expectations, or how do you go from a local dimension where participatory budget has a direct impact in the life of the people to a national-wide. And being responsible for digital and modernization of public administrations, I focus obviously very much on the digital side. You referred to Decidim, that is born in a city like Barcelona, and it was very much used on the consultation for the future of Europe. But the challenge between consulting at local level, at national level, or even at European level, is rather different. So we are all in the learning. Yes, we have programs. I mean, if you tell me, are we proud of having a program that invites our people in our public administration to generate ideas and be creative and propose solutions that are closer to the citizens? Yes, we have, and it's very powerful. Are we very proud of having a portal for transparency that brings to citizens and all interested civic society organizations all the information about everything that we invest? Particularly important in Europe and in Portugal, a country that is obviously engaged very much in the Resilience Pact in Europe. Yes, we have it. I mean, is it good to have this possibility to involve everybody in consultations prior to the definition of the legal final verification and writing? Yes, it is. But the more you do like this, the more you create the need to engage with other people. Yes, cultural, this is particularly important. How do we bring to a country this cultural participation? And yes, we also created one specific day, that is the day of the participation, annual participatory day. But this is just one element in changing the mindset. And when we look to the results of the trust report that has been published, we see, for example, that the trust is higher in the municipalities than the local, rather than in the government. And I would say that is probably natural because there is a proximity. But it is for us now in the digital world to try to understand how we can engage more forcefully. And in Portugal, we have a very interesting program that is probably well known, and for some of you, that is a program called Simplex. And this program has been, for some years, trying to simplify the perception of the public administration vis-a-vis the citizen. And one of the things that we want is to make 3 words very important in this context. First, make the public administration closer to the citizen. Anticipate and automatize. And anticipate because even for some of the persons in our society, some of the rights that they would have, they don't know that because they are part of the divide, part of the social divide, part of the financial divide, part of the social divide. And so we need to be, as the digital gives us this possibility. Can we actually anticipate the needs? Can we cross information from one sector of the government to the other one to try to invite a young lady that is pregnant and whose social and financial situation is not so wealthy to actually benefit automatically from one particular support? And that's what we need to do. We need to do this anticipation, automatization to make sure that the people in reality see the benefits. And this is part of what Martin said, is not just to consult, is also to identify the impact, and an impact that is visible for people, especially the ones that are in the divide of the multiple divides that we have in our society. That's certainly the challenge that we have to do, be able to listen, but actually demonstrate the impact of what we listen in making better regulatory frameworks, better legal frameworks, and in the end, better, more well-being for the people.
That's a lovely note to finish on from that side. So as you all know, we're under a lot of time pressure here. So what I would say is I'm going to ask the panelists for each of just what's your one concluding hope or recommendation in a sentence each for the topics we've discussed today. I'll start with you, Paul, because you're closest to me, sorry.
No worries. Look, I'm an optimist, and I know you asked for one, I'll give you 2. One is, I think the democracy in the end has a better sales pitch than autocracy. In the end, democracy delivers for people, whether it's concrete things like services and perhaps less concrete things like rights. I think in the end, it is about us just being able to better sell it, because in the end, it's a much better product. Second one, I think there is glimmers of hope if you look at civic space. There are progressive leaders across the world that are really strong in supporting civic space. What we want to do in the coming years is to connect them, to give them a platform, to recognize them, and to show, like, look, this is what progressive political leaders can do to protect and support civic space. So not focus on the ones that are extremely problematic, because there's only so much you can do to move them forward, but actually try and inspire the others by giving the strong ones a platform.
Thank you. Martin, in 1 or 2 lines, your key recommendations.
Thank you. I think that the fact that we are having this conversation means that we are willing to address some of the historical shortcomings that many of our democracies have been struggling with for the last few decades. So in that sense, I am optimistic because we have an opportunity to really make those changes that have been waiting for a while now. The challenge, though, of course, is that in a crisis like this, if we do not act, then the consequences could be really negative or have very problematic results. So in that sense, I am optimistic because we are willing to address these challenges, but we definitely need to get serious about this.
Thank you. Hendrik?
Yeah, I think my main, especially optimistic takeaway is that we make participation between election cycles the default and not the exception, and that we manage to institutionalize all those great ideas and solutions that are out there in the long term in democratic thinking and democratic acting as well.
Elsa?
Well, I could make mine any of the final sentences of the other speakers, but I would say, in addition to those, that I really hope that very soon, protecting civic space is something that we all have to do every day, on an everyday basis, whether we're individuals, whether we're civil society organizations, whether we're governments, whether we're businesses. This is a constant fight. Today we're seeing two different trends. One is deepening somehow participation and at the same time closing of the civic space, as was already mentioned. And my hope is that we're able to take those two together and own the complete story as governments or as the OECD for us.
And to the Minister.
Well, yes, I could also subscribe a lot of the comments of my colleagues here, but I would say that citizens are actually at the beginning and at the end of the democratic process. Digital brings a lot of opportunities and risks, and I think that we are not too many to reinvent a future that will bring a digital democracy to our countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to very briefly say that there's a couple of themes that I've heard coming out today. One is that, which is I think very powerful, that actually civic participation and civic space is in the interest of having, successful countries, good acting government, and that's a really important point. That the quality of those relationships, both in proximity and even in formalization, is an extremely important point as well that's come out consistently. More women, because we've seen in the places where it's succeeded in a number of different ways in civil assemblies that feminist movements and women have been involved as well. And also I think that how we move beyond some of the traditional accountability frameworks actually more into spaces of peer accountability, modernization, etc. And maybe a final point would be that, as always, a lot of the technological innovations really provide us new opportunities to reach communities, but we need to be really mindful not to exacerbate existing divisions in society, and we also need to be very careful that we manage the risks with human rights protections and rule of law, not to counterintuitively do that. So it's been such a really fruitful discussion. Thank you so much for bearing with me and keeping as close as we could to time today. It's been an excellent discussion, and looking forward to the rest of the conference. Thank you all.